In 1999, the city of Lahore, in Pakistan, became the hunting ground for one of history's most prolific serial killers. In just 6 months, Javed Iqbal claimed 100 young victims. The scale of his crimes would shock even the most hardened investigators. This is Blood Trails, World's Worst Criminals Show. My name is Chase Austin, best-selling author of Sam Wick and Axel Monk thriller series. And this is the true story of Javed Iqbal, his victims, the city that failed them, and the justice system that struggled to cope with crimes almost too horrific to comprehend. It began on a sweltering July morning in 1999. 9-year-old Faisal Razak left his home in one of Lahore's countless overcrowded neighborhoods. Like thousands of other children in the city, Faisal worked to help feed his family. His days were spent in a stuffy workshop, folding cardboard boxes for pennies. It wasn't an easy life, but it was survival. On July 9th, he left for work as usual. His parents never saw him again. At first, Faisal's disappearance seemed like a tragic but isolated incident. Then 13-year-old Shakil Hassan vanished on his way to school. His school books were found scattered near a busy intersection, but Shakil had disappeared without a trace. Days later, Faraz Khan stepped out to buy flour from a nearby store. A 5-minute errand that turned into an eternal absence. The pattern was emerging, but few noticed. Taslim Ullah, 14, Abdul Majid, 16, Zishan Nazir, 13, and Dilawar Hussain, 15, all vanished within weeks of each other. They shared a common thread. All came from Lahore's poorest neighborhoods. All were young, and all disappeared without witnesses. Their desperate families beat a path to police stations across the city. The response was always the same: dismissive shrugs and empty reassurances. "Check with your relatives," they'd say. "These boys probably ran away. They'll come back when they're hungry." But these weren't runaways. They'd been taken by a predator hiding in plain sight. Each victim had a story. Each had parents who still waited, hoping their child would come home. Instead, they would soon learn the truth. Their children had met a monster who looked like an ordinary man, who kept receipts for acid and photographed his victims, who turned 3 traumatized teenagers into accomplices, and who had operated in plain sight until he decided it was time to take credit for his crimes. To understand how such a thing could happen, you need to understand Pakistan in 1999. The Human Rights Commission had reported a staggering statistic: 11 million child workers in Pakistan, half under age 10. Children as young as 6 worked in factories, swept streets, or begged for money. In this world of desperate poverty and official indifference, children were easy targets. Among these vulnerable youth was one Ejaz Muhammad, known to everyone as Kaka. He and his older brother worked as street masseurs, carrying bottles of scented oil and offering head and shoulder massages in the city's parks. They wore ankle bracelets with bright stones that jingled as they walked, a sound that became familiar in the gardens where they worked. Men paid them for head and shoulder massages. Sometimes the men also would take them to their bedrooms. And some of these same men would force themselves on Ejaz and his brother. It was a cruel trade and a desperate existence, but neither Ejaz nor his brother could have guessed that it was about to take another turn for the worst. One October day in 1999, in the historic gardens of Minari, Pakistan, 2 teenage boys approached the brothers. The offer seemed too good to refuse: double pay for a massage job with their boss. In a city where every extra rupee meant another meal, such opportunities were hard to pass up. The 2 boys led Kaka through Lahore's maze-like streets to house 16B on Ravi Road. Inside waited a small, unremarkable man with glasses and neatly parted hair: Javed Iqbal. Kaka's brother, following the common practice of splitting up to find more work, left to find another client. It was the last time anyone would see Kaka alive. What followed was a nightmare that would haunt Lahore for years to come. A cunning predator who specifically targeted society's most vulnerable. A police force that failed to connect the dots until it was too late. Parents who spent days and nights searching the city's dark alleys, holding on to hope, even as their worst fears proved true. Even after human remains were found in Iqbal's house, questions remained. How had he operated so long without detection? How had he lured so many victims? And perhaps most disturbingly, had he acted alone? The investigation would reveal a city's darkest secrets, the exploitation of children, the indifference of authorities, and the devastating consequences of treating some lives as worth less than others. But for the families of Faisal, Kaka, and 98 other boys, these questions mattered less than the simple, devastating truth. Their children were gone, taken by a monster who had walked among them, hidden behind ordinary glasses and a neat haircut. Lahore would never be the same, and neither would they. But why no one took this case seriously? In Pakistan, thousands of boys run away from home every year. Most of them end up on the streets. At night, they huddle together near garbage dumps, high on heroin or samad bond, a highly addictive polychloroprene adhesive sold off the shelves. Most parents don't file missing person reports with the police because they are usually turned away. With large families to feed, parents usually give up the search for their missing child after a few days of visiting hospitals and morgues. All of them hope to hear a knock on the door one day and to find their child on their doorstep. The year 1999 was a tough one for Pakistanis. In May, military leader General Pervez Musharraf took over the government in a coup. The economy was reeling under U.S. sanctions imposed in the wake of the nuclear tests conducted by the military a year earlier. Along with that, General Pervez Musharraf had waged a war on India. At Kargil, known as the Kargil War that took place from May to July 1999. Pakistan lost that war, and with that 4,000 of his soldiers and its reputation. During that time, for the Pakistan police, reports of missing children were very low on the priority list. The gardens of Minare Pakistan seemed peaceful from a distance. Kids played, families picnicked, and street vendors called out their wares. But in 1999, these gardens became a killing ground. Here, Javed Iqbal hunted children with the help of 3 teenage boys: Sajid Ahmed, 17, Muhammad Nadim, 15, and Muhammad Sair, 13. These boys weren't just accomplices. They were victims themselves, broken by Iqbal's abuse until they became his tools. Together, they perfected a system: spot a vulnerable child, promise them money or food, and lead them to house 16B on Ravi Road in Lahore. None of these children ever walked out alive. Iqbal's method was coldly efficient. First came the assault, then strangulation. Finally, he dismembered the bodies and dissolved them in acid before dumping the remains in Lahore's river. Each murder was documented, photographed, and catalogued. A grotesque bookkeeping of death. But no one cared about these children because they were poor. And when, in late November, a letter from someone who claimed to have killed 100 runaway boys arrived at the Lahore police office, it raised little suspicion. But who had sent that letter? Apparently, it was Iqbal himself. But why? Iqbal had set himself a target: 100 victims. Not 99, not 101. 100 exactly. When he reached this number in November 1999, Iqbal wanted recognition for his work. He packaged up his evidence, photos, detailed confessions, even receipts, and mailed it to the Lahore police. The package included photos of each victim taken moments before their deaths, a handwritten diary describing each murder. The victims' names, addresses, and clothing descriptions. Detailed accounts of how he disposed of the bodies. A clinical breakdown of his expenses, acid costs, transportation, tools. Tariq Kambo, a deputy superintendent of police, DSP, a mid-ranking officer, reluctantly went to the address from where the letter was mailed. 16 Bahravi Road, the same place where the young masseur had gone missing. Public records of what happened at the house that day revealed just how unprepared the police were in dealing with the master manipulator. Iqbal was at home, but as police questioned him about the letter, he began to behave erratically. At one point, he took out his gun. "Leave, or I'll shoot myself," he threatened. Police didn't take him into custody. They didn't even bother to go inside the 3-bedroom house, which was constructed like a Russian matryoshka doll, with one room built inside the other. Kambo left and also let Iqbal keep his licensed gun. Iqbal should have been known to the police. Over the past decade, at least 2 sodomy complaints involving minor boys had been filed against him. They had dealt with Iqbal's stunts before and dismissed him as mentally unstable. "This man can't be a killer of 100 kids. He's a nutcase," Kambo told his superiors. This mistake would haunt them. Iqbal had an inflated sense of his own importance. His acquaintances recall that he regularly boasted about his alleged ties with politicians and bureaucrats. Now he was frustrated the police weren't taking him seriously. Angry at being ignored, Iqbal sent his confession package to Yang newspaper. The Hunt for a Monster. The photos were the most disturbing element. 100 young faces looking into the camera, many smiling, none knowing they were seeing their last day alive. One boy wore a bright red shirt and clutched a candy bar. Iqbal had noted in his diary that the shirt dissolved slower than the body. The journalists who received the package did what the police hadn't. They investigated. Finding Iqbal's house empty, they broke in. The stench hit them first, a mixture of industrial chemicals and something worse, something primordial that triggered deep survival instincts. Death had a home here. In room after room, they found evidence that turned their stomachs. Barrels lined the walls, each containing partially dissolved human remains. In one, they found a torso. In another, a leg still wearing a jingling ankle bracelet, a detail that would later identify one of the victims, a young street masseur known as Kaka. The house held other horrors. A makeshift acid bath in the bathroom. Clothes of various sizes, neatly folded. Children's shoes arranged in pairs. Photographs on the walls of boys, before and after. Detailed ledgers recording each murder. Receipts for acid purchases. Tools for dismemberment, cleaned and organized. The scale of evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just Pakistan's worst serial killer. This was one of the most prolific child killers in recorded history. 100 lives ended in this ordinary house on a dead-end street, while the city lived and breathed around it, unaware. When the journalists started checking Iqbal's list of addresses, a pattern emerged. At each door they knocked, they found families frozen in time, bedrooms left untouched, school uniforms still hanging on hooks, parents who jumped at every sound, hoping it was their son coming home. Each address confirmed another victim, each family another thread in a tapestry of grief that covered Lahore. On December 3rd, Young newspaper broke the story. Claim of murder of 100 kids. Inside were photos of 57 confirmed missing boys, Iqbal's detailed confession, and evidence from his house of horrors. The story hit Pakistan like a bomb. In the police station, they set up a room just for the clothing. Hundreds of pieces sorted by size, t-shirts, pants, sandals, school uniforms. Parents came in waves. A mother recognized her son's shirt by the patch she'd sewn on the elbow. A father identified his boy's shoes by the way the heels had worn down. He'd always dragged his feet when he walked, Each piece of clothing became a memorial, each recognition a funeral. The police had screwed up, and everyone knew it. When they'd visited Iqbal's house weeks earlier, the evidence was right there. The acid barrels, the photos, the detailed ledgers of death. But they'd walked away when he pulled a gun. Now they had to live with knowing they could have stopped him sooner. Iqbal claimed he would kill himself in a local lake. Police boats dragged the water for days. Divers searched the murky bottom. Nothing. They launched the biggest manhunt in Pakistani history, but Iqbal had disappeared like the children he'd killed. Then, on December 29th, 1999, a man appeared at the Jang newspaper office. His clothes were ragged, his beard wild, his sandals falling apart. "I am Javed Iqbal," he announced calmly, "killer of 100 children." Just like that, Pakistan's worst serial killer surrendered to journalists instead of police. While they waited for authorities, Iqbal talked. Born in 1961 to a wealthy family, he was the sixth of 8 children. His father's company, Muhammad Ali and Sons, made steel pipes for the city's wealthiest builders. The family owned properties across Lahore, apartment buildings, shops, empty lots waiting for development. They were respected, influential, and deeply religious. Javed Iqbal grew up in a mansion on Brandrath Road, in the heart of Lahore's bustling commercial district. But something was wrong with him. Young Iqbal filled notebooks with dense, cramped writing. He read everything he could find, especially true crime magazines. At night, he'd shock the household awake, demanding his siblings line up behind him as he marched through darkened halls, chanting things no one understood. His brother Ziaul remembers these midnight processions. It was like watching someone possessed. His eyes would be open, but empty. His high school classmates weren't just being cruel when they nicknamed him the Boy Hunter. They were warning each other. The family dragged Iqbal to faith healers, to saints' shrines, to anyone who might explain their son's strangeness. One healer saw the truth. Iqbal was gay in a world that would never accept him. He warned the family not to force marriage on their son. "Blood will flow," the healer said, "if you try to make him something he's not." But in the 1970s Pakistan, a wealthy Muslim family couldn't have a gay son. They pretended not to see how Iqbal watched young boys in the street, ignored the whispers from neighbors about what happened in his private rooms, looked away. When teenage boys started visiting the house, as Iqbal entered his 20s, the whispers grew louder. Parents warned their sons to avoid him. Shopkeepers wouldn't let him linger near their young workers. Local kids gave his house a wide berth, telling stories about what happened to boys who went inside. His writing changed, too. The dense notebooks filled with darker thoughts. He wrote about power, about revenge, about making people sorry they'd ever judged him. He sent stories to magazines about men who lived double lives, who took what they wanted and never got caught. Behind his family's wealth, behind the religious facade and business respectability, Iqbal was transforming. The midnight wanderer who terrorized his siblings was becoming something worse. The strange boy who filled notebooks with cramped writing was planning things no one dared imagine. Years later, when police found his final journals, they saw how it all connected. The midnight marches where he made people follow him. The writing that grew darker every year. The way he used his family's money and influence to silence complaints. It was all practice for what was coming. The faith healer had been right about blood flowing, but even he hadn't seen the full scope of the horror ahead. Not even Iqbal's family, who'd watched him grow stranger year by year, could have guessed their troubled son would become Pakistan's worst serial killer. The boy who'd once forced his siblings to march through dark halls would lead 100 children to their deaths. The notebooks that once held strange stories would fill with murder confessions. And the family name that had protected him for so long would become infamous across Pakistan. But no one stopped him. They just watched him grow darker, year by year, until it was too late. And he grew into something worse. A methodical killer who treated murder like bookkeeping. His ledgers detailed everything: victims' names, dates, costs of acid and tools, transportation expenses for body disposal. Each entry perfectly organized, each death reduced to numbers in a column. The making of a monster. At 17, Javed Iqbal lived like a prince in Lahore. His private villa hosted endless parties. His motorcycle roared through the streets. Money flowed like water. But behind the facade of the spoiled rich kid lurked something darker. A predator, learning his trade. Teenagers flocked to his villa. Who could resist? Here was a kid their age living without rules, throwing parties and sharing his wealth. Some came for the lifestyle. Others came for the gifts. All of them were potential targets. Iqbal's hunting methods were calculated. He favored pen pal magazines, a perfect tool for a predator in the pre-internet age. He'd write letters dripping with friendship and understanding, share secrets, build trust, request photos. Then he'd zero in on the most vulnerable ones. In 1980, 11-year-old Rana Fasad found an intriguing ad in Al Tahir magazine. A man named Javed Iqbal wanted pen pals to trade stamps. Nafasat and his 6th grade friends in Sargodha wrote their first letters, not knowing they were writing to a predator. Iqbal's letters came like gifts. Written in bright markers, green, blue, yellow, each one sprayed with expensive cologne. Money tucked inside, just 20 rupees, but a fortune to schoolboys. Share your photos, he'd write. Come visit me in Lahore. Each letter more urgent than the last. While these innocent boys wrote back about stamps and school, people in Iqbal's Lahore neighborhood watched their children playing and whispered warnings. Keep your sons away from that house, mothers would say. Don't let them walk alone past his door. Everyone knew what Iqbal was. No one knew how to stop him. In 1990, the whispers turned to screams. Iqbal lured a 9-year-old boy home and assaulted him. For the first time, parents filed charges. But Iqbal had money. He paid off the family, paid off the police. The case vanished. His own family finally broke, splitting their inheritance just to get him away from them. With his share of money, Iqbal built his own world. A new house. A metal workshop filled with underage workers, mostly runaways no one would miss. He bought them new clothes, fed them well, took them on trips to the mountains. One boy named Sajid became his favorite, his lieutenant. The other workers called Sajid the chosen one. The pattern was familiar to crime experts. American serial killer John Wayne Gacy had done the same. Hiring young men for his business, gaining their trust, making them dependent, then killing them. But in Pakistan, no one made this connection. Instead, Iqbal expanded. He opened a video game arcade near his house, the first in the area. Built elaborate aquariums full of exotic fish, kept snakes in glass tanks. Every day, dozens of boys would crowd inside, pressing against the glass, never noticing they were the ones being watched. He spent money like water on these kids. His nephew Awais recalls. Fireworks, candies, toys, whatever would draw them in. Parents thought he was generous. Some even thanked him for keeping their children entertained and off the streets. His process never varied. First came the gifts, then money, then private invitations to his villa. By the time his victims realized the price of his generosity, it was too late. His family watched the parade of young boys through their son's villa with growing horror. In conservative Pakistan, homosexuality wasn't just a sin. It was a crime, punishable by law. But Iqbal wasn't just gay. He was a predator with a specific taste. Young, vulnerable boys who could be manipulated and controlled. Only his father stayed blind to the danger, protecting his son from consequences. Later, survivors would describe how Iqbal would boast about this protection, telling his victims that no one would believe them over his father's money and influence. As Iqbal entered his 20s, his targets stayed the same age, or got younger. His villa became notorious. Local kids warned each other, "Don't go there alone. Don't accept his gifts. Don't believe his promises." Finally, his father tried damage control through arranged marriage. In 1983, Iqbal agreed to marry a woman. Crime expert Stephen Holmes sees this often. These predators try to build normal lives as cover. The marriages, the businesses, the generosity. It's all camouflage for their true nature. But Iqbal had a twisted reason. He was already abusing her underage brother. The marriage gave him easier access to his victim. When the family discovered the truth months later, the marriage shattered. Desperate, his family arranged another marriage. This time, Iqbal chose his victim's young sister, again providing cover for his true interests. This marriage, too, ended in horror when the truth emerged. After the second failed marriage, his family retreated into shame. Iqbal was left unchecked. For years, he prowled Lahore streets, targeting boys from its poorest neighborhoods. Everyone knew. No one acted. The silence had a price. Poverty. Most victims were street kids, child laborers, or runaways. Their families couldn't fight back. Some couldn't even report their missing children, knowing the police would dismiss them. Iqbal had found the perfect hunting ground. His villa became a processing center for abuse. Boys would enter, thinking they'd found a generous friend. Inside waited a calculated predator who documented everything. He kept photos, wrote detailed accounts, saved souvenirs. These records would later help police identify victims, the ones who survived. The warning signs blazed like neon. Perfumed letters to schoolboys. Police reports that disappeared. A workshop full of homeless children. An arcade where boys vanished. But Lahore refused to see the pattern. Maybe they couldn't imagine what was coming. Maybe they didn't want to. Then, in 1990, Iqbal's careful system cracked. He targeted the wrong boy, the son of a prominent community leader. For the first time, his victim had the power to fight back. The comfortable shield of money and influence began to crack. But it was too late. The teenage predator had evolved into something worse. His need for control had grown. Simple abuse no longer satisfied him. He wanted more. Over the next 9 years, he would kill 100 boys, keeping meticulous records of each death. Those early days in the villa had been his training ground. The pen pal letters, the gifts, the careful grooming of victims, all practice for his later crimes. He'd learned which boys wouldn't be missed, which families couldn't fight back, which police officers could be bought. Lahore had watched him become a monster, one victim at a time. They'd heard the warnings, seen the signs, known the danger, but they'd looked away, hoping someone else would stop him. No one did. And 100 families would pay the price for that silence. On Brandreth Road, Iqbal's childhood home still stands. Sometimes people walk past and whisper about the strange boy who grew up there, who filled notebooks with dark thoughts, who made his siblings march at midnight. They wonder if anyone could have stopped him then, before the possessed child became a monster who hunted children. In his confession, Iqbal revealed his process. He'd choose boys from poor areas Usually street kids or child laborers. His teenage accomplices, themselves victims he'd groomed, would lure them with promises of food or money. At his house, he'd photograph them. These photos were his trophies, showing each boy's last moments of innocence before realizing the truth. The actual killings were mechanical, efficient. Strangulation, dismemberment, acid, bodies dissolved in bathtubs, remains dumped in rivers, then back to his ledgers to record the expenses. Some entries included chilling notes. This one took more acid than usual. Had to buy extra cleaning supplies. Parents came looking, told them he ran away. When police finally searched his house, they found evidence that turned hardened detectives pale. Acid-scarred bathtubs, tools neatly arranged, a closet full of children's shoes, organized by size, photos everywhere. Smiling boys who didn't know they were posing for their own obituaries. And those ledgers, recording death, with the precision of an accountant. But the clothing pile at the police station told the real story. Parents still come today, sifting through faded fabric, looking for pieces of their lost children. Each shirt, each shoe, each sock represents a boy who walked out one morning and never came home. A child who met a monster with a neat ledger and a bathtub full of acid. A life reduced to an entry in a book, while somewhere in Lahore, a mother still keeps a bedroom exactly as her son left it, unable to let go of that last thread of hope. They also found those early letters, still smelling faintly of cologne. In the same drawer were photos of dead children. The colored markers had been replaced by acid barrels, the 20 rupee notes by detailed murder ledgers. The pen pal predator had evolved, leaving a trail of clues no one bothered to follow. Until it was too late. Until 100 families lost their sons. Until those bright marker letters became evidence in Pakistan's worst serial killer case. In Sargodha, Rauna Facade still has one of those letters. The colors have faded, but the cologne lingers. Sometimes I read it, he says, and wonder how many boys like me wrote back. How many visited? How many never came home? The answers lie in a police evidence room in Lahore, in a drawer full of letters written in colored markers, each one the first step toward tragedy. The monster gets caught and released. In 1990, Iqbal made his first big mistake. He raped a 9-year-old boy from a respected family, not one of his usual targets from the streets. This boy had a father with influence, money, and connections. For the first time, Iqbal faced real consequences. When police arrived at his villa, Iqbal was gone. So they arrested his father and 2 brothers instead. It wasn't legal, but they didn't care. They figured the loving son would surrender to save his family. They were wrong. For 7 days, Iqbal's elderly father and innocent brothers sat in jail cells. Iqbal knew. He just didn't care. The man who had protected him, funded his lifestyle, and shielded him from consequences wasn't worth a week of inconvenience. The police changed tactics. They raided his villa again, this time arresting one of his teenage accomplices, boys Iqbal had groomed from victims into helpers. Within hours, Iqbal was at the police station. Not for his father, not for his brothers, but for his boy. Money solved everything. Cash for the police, cash for the victim's family. Case closed. The system worked exactly as Iqbal had learned it would. Everyone had a price. But predators can't stop. Soon Iqbal assaulted another boy, this time from a wealthy family. It landed him in jail for 6 months, his first real punishment. Inside, he planned his next move. After release, Iqbal developed a new strategy. Become a fixture at the police station. He'd file pointless complaints. Show up daily, chat with officers, bring small gifts. The police found him annoying but harmless, just another local nuisance. This was exactly what he wanted. Then came the gunpoint attacks. 2 more boys. This time, the neighborhood elders intervened with their own brand of justice. They held a council where Iqbal confessed, made him sign a promise to never touch another child, forced him to walk to 100 local shops, apologizing at each one. It was worse than useless. You can't shame a predator. You can't reform a monster with signatures and forced apologies. The elders chose empty gestures over real action. Why? Because of Iqbal's father, the community patriarch who'd spent decades building relationships and influence. These failures had a price. Each time Iqbal walked free, he learned the same lesson. Nothing could stop him. Not police, not parents, not community elders. He was untouchable. Then his father died. The old man's last act was to reward his worst son, leaving Iqbal 3.5 million rupees. The shield of family reputation died with him. Now Iqbal had money, freedom, and nothing left to lose. The warning signs had been flashing for years. The villa full of young boys. The 2 failed marriages to victims' sisters. The constant complaints about him in the neighborhood. The arrests that led nowhere. The victims who kept coming forward. The public confession that changed nothing. Each time society could have stopped him, it chose the easier path. Pay him off. Let him go. Look the other way. Hope someone else would handle it. No one did. And now Iqbal had money, a tested system for avoiding consequences, and an appetite that was growing darker. The boy hunter was evolving into something worse. Lahore would pay for its silence. In the next few years, 100 families would learn the true cost of letting a predator walk free. Those missed chances, the light sentences, the bribes, the useless public shaming, would haunt them all. Because Iqbal wasn't done. He wasn't even close. The monster was just getting started, and this time, no one would be able to buy their way out of what was coming. The police station where he'd become a regular visitor still stands. Sometimes officers from those days talk about him, the annoying man with the daily complaints who turned out to be a serial killer. They remember his smirk, his casual manner, his small gifts. They didn't know they were watching a monster learn their system, find their weak points, figure out exactly how far he could go. They found out too late. They all did. The business of evil. When Iqbal got his inheritance, he built a predator's paradise. His mansion in Shanat town had everything. A deep pond, a basement with soundproof walls, a swimming pool hidden from neighbors' eyes. He bought 4 cars to cruise Lahore's streets, a Fiat Spiro, a Lancer, a Toyota, and a Suzuki FX. The Spiro became infamous. Parents would warn their kids about the blue car full of boys that never came back. But Iqbal wasn't just spending money. He was investing in hunting grounds. His master plan started with Lahore's first video game store. He sold his mansion to fund it, moving to a smaller place. The store was perfectly designed, dark, exciting, full of flashing lights and new games no other shop had. Kids begged their parents for money to go there. Soon, hundreds of boys crowded inside daily. Iqbal's system was precise. First, cheap tokens, then free games. He'd make friends with regular customers, learn their names, their families' situations. Then came the trap. Drop money on the floor. He'd hide and watch who took it. When he caught them, they'd face a horrible choice, the back room or police involvement. After the assault, he'd offer them the stolen money plus extra, teaching them their first lesson about keeping secrets. The neighborhood finally caught on. They forced him out, but it didn't matter. Iqbal just moved across Lahore and started over. Each new business was designed to lure children. An aquarium where kids could feed exotic fish. A gym offering free memberships to teenagers. An air-conditioned school charging half the usual fees. A video rental store with private viewing rooms, a game arcade with the newest machines. The police knew everything. Regular complaints came in, but Iqbal had built a shield. His crime magazine praised police officers by name. He had politicians' private numbers in his phone. Bribes flowed regularly to key officials. His family name still carried weight. Most victims stayed quiet, knowing police might side with him. He operated openly for years. Parents whispered warnings about him. Kids avoided his businesses, but no one could stop him. Then came September 1998. Iqbal hired a 15-year-old masseur. Maybe he felt invincible that night. Maybe he was careless. After the assault, he fell asleep. His first big mistake. The teenager called a friend. They looked at the man who'd hurt so many kids, now helpless on his bed. Then they unleashed years of community rage. The beating was brutal. Skull fractured, jaw shattered. When they finished, Iqbal was barely breathing. He spent 22 days in a coma at Lahore General Hospital. He woke to find everything gone. During his coma, his family had sold it all. His house, all 4 cars, the businesses he'd built, his furniture, even his clothes. They paid his hospital bills but wouldn't spend their own money. They were done protecting him. For 6 months, Iqbal couldn't walk without help. He had time to think in that hospital bed, time to remember every face that visited him, and those who didn't, time to plan. The doctors saved his body, but something in his mind had broken. The predator who'd hunted Lahore's boys for decades was transforming into something worse. The need for control, for power, for revenge was consuming him. When Iqbal finally walked out of that hospital, Lahore should have been celebrating. Their monster was broke, beaten, exposed. His hunting grounds were gone. His shields had fallen. Instead, they'd created something deadlier. A predator who'd learned that letting victims live was too dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose. Those hospital bills had bought Lahore's children a few months of safety. When Iqbal recovered, he wouldn't just hurt boys anymore. He'd start keeping count of his kills. The video game store still stands empty in Shahad town. Sometimes old-timers point it out to their kids. That's where the monster hunted. That's where we could have stopped him. That's where Lahore's biggest nightmare began. But the real nightmare was just starting. The final hunt. After the beating that nearly killed him, Iqbal moved in with his elderly mother. She was his last protector, the only one who still saw him as her little boy. When she died of a heart attack months later, something deep inside him shattered. He spent weeks alone in her house, his broken body healing while his mind twisted into something darker. He needed someone to blame. Not himself. Never himself. After weeks of brooding in that empty house, he found his target. Boys. All boys. My mother cried for me. He later told reporters, his voice flat and emotionless. I wanted 100 mothers to cry for their children. From June to November 1999, Iqbal launched his revenge. He had help. 3 teenage boys he'd groomed into loyal servants. Sajid Ahmed, 17, who'd known Iqbal for years. Muhammad Nadim, 15, who would later tell police everything. And Muhammad Sair, just 13, who helped lure the youngest victims. 2 of them had helped bring in the masseur, who'd beaten Iqbal. Now they helped him kill. His victims came from everywhere. Some had families who had searched for months, plastering Lahore with missing posters. Some were runaways, who'd thought Iqbal offered shelter. Some were orphans no one would miss. The oldest was 16, with dreams of becoming a doctor. The youngest was 6, still carrying his school books when Iqbal took him. Iqbal photographed each victim. He'd make them smile, tell them to look at the camera, capture that last moment of innocence. Then he'd pin their pictures to his walls like butterflies in a collection. 100 faces stared down at him while he slept. On February 17th, 2000, those same photos landed on a judge's desk. The evidence room looked like a museum of horrors. Iqbal's handwritten confessions detailed each murder. Video interviews showed him bragging about the crimes. 86 pairs of children's shoes sat in tagged evidence bags. Clothes waited for parents to identify. Pictures showed body parts floating in acid vats. The prosecution brought 105 witnesses. 73 were parents who had to look at those photos, those clothes, those shoes, searching for proof their missing children were never coming home. The photo studio owner testified about Iqbal's weekly visits to develop pictures of smiling boys. The rickshaw driver described helping move barrels that smelled of chemicals and death. But Iqbal changed his story. The man who'd sent detailed confessions to newspapers now claimed innocence, said it was all staged, a humanitarian effort to highlight the problems of runaway children. In court, he turned tragedy into theater, interrupting testimony to demand hot meals, complaining about wanting a warmer sweater while parents of his victims sobbed feet away. The monster who'd killed 100 boys treated his trial like a game. He'd never grown up from that spoiled teenager in the villa with the motorcycle. Now he sat in court, smirking at grieving mothers, playing word games with the judge, acting as if this was all some strange entertainment put on for his amusement. But this time, no one was laughing. No bribes would work here. No family influence would save him. No police friends would look the other way. The boy hunter had become Pakistan's worst serial killer, and justice was finally closing in. The evidence room still exists in Lahore's courthouse. The photos are gone now, but sometimes clerks say they can feel those 100 young faces watching them, wondering how many chances society had to stop this monster before he turned their smiles into evidence tags. The final hunt was over. But for 100 families in Lahore, the grief was just beginning. Justice and questions. The evidence room was overflowing with children's clothes when the mothers came to identify them. One woman collapsed when she found her son's shirt, pointing with trembling fingers to the Mickey Mouse patch she'd sewn on just weeks before he vanished. Another recognized the uneven stitching on a collar. She'd been learning to use a sewing machine when she made it. Each piece of clothing told a story of loss. Each mother's recognition, another nail in Iqbal's coffin. But in court, Iqbal remained untouchable. He knew the international press was watching Pakistan's biggest serial killer case. He played to the cameras, claiming he'd bought the clothes from second-hand markets. When mothers broke down during testimony, he would yawn or ask for coffee. He thought he might actually win, because the police had made fatal mistakes. During the manhunt, they'd brought in one of Iqbal's friends for questioning. The official report said he jumped from a third-floor window at the police station. The autopsy told a different story. Broken fingers, burns, signs of systematic torture. Iqbal's lawyers seized on this, painting a picture of police brutality and forced confessions. The case took an even darker turn when Iqbal's lawyer stood up in court and announced someone powerful had threatened him to abandon the case. The courtroom erupted. Was this proof of a conspiracy, a desperate legal maneuver, or something worse? The lawyer never named names, but he stayed on the case until the end, looking over his shoulder every day. The defense tried arguing that neighbors would have noticed if Iqbal was really killing children in their midst. How could 100 boys disappear into one house without anyone raising alarms? But when the judge challenged them to produce even one of the missing children alive, they fell silent. Not one boy out of 100 could be found. After a month of testimonies, evidence, and Iqbal's theatrical performances, the judge had enough. His sentence was unprecedented. Iqbal and his oldest accomplice, 17-year-old Sajid, would be hanged in the Minar-e-Pakistan gardens, the same place where they'd hunted their victims. Their bodies would be cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid while their victims' families watched. 100 pieces for 100 victims. The sentence was too medieval even for Pakistan. It violated Islamic law and international human rights codes. The government quickly amended it to a simple hanging, though Iqbal's smirk suggested he never believed they'd kill him at all. In prison, his delusions grew. He told visiting journalists that God had chosen him for a divine purpose, claimed international human rights groups were fighting to free him, said he had powerful friends who would ensure his release. None of this was true, but Iqbal believed his own lies until the end. That end came 1 year after his conviction. Guards found Iqbal and one accomplice dead in their cells. The official story was suicide. They'd supposedly hanged themselves with their prison shirts. But once again, the autopsy revealed torture marks. Someone had beaten them extensively before they died. Iqbal's family spun conspiracy theories. They claimed he was killed because he knew too much, that he had names of government officials who'd abused his boys. A Pakistani Jeffrey Epstein, silenced before he could expose his powerful clients. But there was a simpler explanation. 4 days before his death, Pakistan's highest Islamic court had agreed to hear his appeal. Perhaps someone decided Iqbal had lived long enough. The truth died with him in that prison cell. But his legacy lives on in Lahore. Parents still warn their children about the gardens where he hunted. The house on Ravi Road stands empty, its walls etched with graffiti cursing his name. 100 families still mourn, still ask how society let this happen. Because Iqbal wasn't a shadow monster who struck from darkness. He operated in broad daylight, protected by money, power, and a system that looked the other way. He flaunted his crimes for decades before justice finally caught him. And even then, questions remain about whether justice was served or simply more darkness piled on darkness. In the end, like his victims, Iqbal disappeared into acid and shadow, leaving behind only questions and grief. But while his victims were innocent children, he was a monster of society's making, proof that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we choose not to see until it's too late. The gardens of Minar-e-Pakistan still stand. Children still play there. But the parents of Lahore now hold their children closer, knowing that sometimes monsters don't hide under beds or in closets. Sometimes they keep ledgers, take photos, and walk among us, counting their kills like businessmen counting profits. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time with another chilling crime tale.